The federal public defender for the Middle District of Tennessee today calling for Governor Bill Lee to launch yet another investigation into the Tennessee Department of Corrections execution practices.
Yeah, this comes after the attempted execution of Tony Carruthers, who was convicted of a triple murder in 1994. Action News 5's Michaela Redmond has more on why they say it was a nightmare from start to finish.
Amy Harwell with the federal public defender for the Middle District of Tennessee says Tony Carruthers, who has spent over 30 years on death row for a gruesome 1994 triple murder in South Memphis, was tortured for over an hour and a half as unqualified executioners attempted lethal injection. Statements also made by Carruthers' attorney.
This was a tortured, botched execution.
I was a media witness and heard him groaning from the observation room. As Harwell tells me, Carruthers was punctured over a dozen times in his arms, hand, and feet.
He was in pain. I mean, he said he was in pain. The fact that he said, I can feel that, it hurts, and they stuck him anyway, that is absolute torture and a violation of the Eighth Amendment, without question.
The Eighth Amendment of the Constitution says excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel or unusual punishments inflicted.
The IV line in his shoulder was filled with blood, like backfilled.
Harwell says FPD previously sued TDOC in a Davidson County court, alleging the state's lethal injection protocol would cause a torturous death from insufficient staff training. During a 2025 deposition, Dr. Mark Fowler confirmed he was the physician who oversaw the executions of Oscar Smith in May 2025 and Byron Black that August. Harwell states Fowler admitted under oath that when he declared Byron Black dead, Black still had a normal sinus rhythm and that he was not qualified to establish a central IV line and hasn't since 2013. Fowler was also Carruthers' physician, and De Liberato said she questioned his qualifications during the attempted execution.
And he kept trying to stick the line, and there was blood coming out. I saw 2 to 3 puncture wounds.
In emergency court filings the day of Carruthers' attempted execution, Harwell asked to stop IV-based execution for Carruthers unless a qualified physician is used and to allow a chosen physician to observe, stating Carruthers' attempted execution was a nightmare from start to finish and one that was completely avoidable. Reporting in Memphis, Michaela Redmond, Action News 5.
The federal public defender was in court today for an emergency hearing in this case, and a state judge granted their request to preserve evidence and material from the failed execution, but left the decision of allowing any outside physician to be present during any future execution up to a federal court. And a hearing on that issue is set for next week.